Well, last Sunday in the calendar I read, guest preacher myself. Now, I'm no guest here, you know that. I'm usually sitting down there at the end of pew number 10. Now, you've known me for a long time, and I think most of you know that I'm not a preacher either. But however, in the calendar it says, sermon. Well, I'm not going to preach a sermon. I just want to have a talk with you. And you have to have a subject, you know. And I thought, well, remembering is a good subject. Of course, as an Irishman would say, I hope I don't forget what I was remembering. But it's very, very kind to be asked to speak on this occasion. It's a one which you all know is very, very close to my heart. And I'm simply going to talk as if I was talking to each one of you individually about the things I remember. Now, of course, I'm a little bit older than most of you, I know. And I can remember back to the first Armistice Day. I was at school, and I remember we were marched down to the drill hall. We didn't call it a fancy name like the gymnasium. Oh no, it was a drill hall. And we were marched down to the drill hall, and then the headmaster told us that the war was over. The war to end all wars was over. Little did he know what lay ahead. Yes, I'm remembering the First World War. I remember in high school being marched down Viewforth to a church, and there we had the act of remembrance, the silence. And I remember standing there thinking to myself, now, I should feel very sad. But it's awfully difficult for a young lad to feel sad. And so I got thinking, well, my Uncle John, he was killed at the Dardanelles. There's my older cousins that were killed in France. And so I tried to get myself in the right frame of mind. But it was very, very difficult. And as you know, of course, they changed it from Armistice Day to Remembrance Day. And I think that was fine. And so we're here this morning to remember. And I hope you'll bear with me as you'll take part in the things which I remember. It's very difficult for younger people to think what it was like, say during 1940, 1941 and so on. But many of you have remembrances of that time. You might have been living over in Britain. You were bombed. Some of you lost your own home. Yes, you can remember quite a bit. And as we stood on the act of remembrance, you were remembering some of those things. Now, the only problem with remembrance is I may get going and forget to stop. However, I remember the young Padre who went to a new unit. And when he appeared on church parade, he had a little piece of paper on his chin. And the commanding officer said, "What happened, Padre?" "Well, sir, I was shaving and I was concentrating on my sermon and I cut myself." Now, after the church parade, the CO went up to him in the mess and said, "Look, Padre, next church parade, would you mind concentrating on your shaving and cut your sermon?" You see, you learn very quickly when you're with men for about 2 years, day in and day out. They pull no punches, believe me. However, as we were singing the hymns and stuff, I looked over there and see a window to my old friend Charlie Nichol. He was minister of this congregation, and very early in the Second World War, he joined up and volunteered as a padre, was posted to the 48th Highlanders over there in Toronto, And he was one of the lucky ones. They were able to get out of France just as it was falling. And he was a senior padre when I knew him. But it was soon found that the older men, especially those from the First World War, were a little bit old for a war of movement. And so many of us younger, I know you're laughing when I say younger men now, but I was young at one time. The younger men, we were asked to volunteer, and of course I had volunteered to go as a combatant, but was turned down because I was a clergyman. However, I was at once taken into the chaplaincy, and there were 10 of us, young chaplains from around this area, and we were shipped down to Windsor, Nova Scotia, and then from there on to the Queen Mary, and with Churchill in it too, we went across and went to Aldershot, and there we had a month's training, basic training, common to all arms. It was to fit us for going to a field unit. And I was very, very fortunate. I was the first one posted to a unit, not because I was best in the course. I think I was the worst and likely wanted to get rid of me. But anyway, I was posted to the Highland Light Infantry of Canada. Now imagine me being posted to a Highland unit. The army do make mistakes once in a while. But anyway, I was posted to them, and I served with them from, well, before D-Day, all the way through, ended up with them and came home with them. And it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. Now, last Thursday, I was through the Gulf. I refuse to call it Cambridge. I was through the Gulf to take part in a memorial service for the lads of my unit. There were only about 40 of us. We're all getting old and infirm, and I conducted the service, and we had it in front of a great big plaque in which are inscribed the names of all those in the Second World War who gave their lives in the HLI. And as I was standing there, I couldn't help but look at them and see some names, just as Charlie Nichols' name came to me there. And I saw many of them, and as soon as I saw the name, I immediately thought of some incident. Yes, I was remembering. One that struck me, oh, and it really hurt to see it because I've often had a twinge of conscience about it. Frank Lott, F. Lott, L-O-T-T. I remember him as a very, very young lad. And we were fighting in the Hopwald Forest. And there was a height of land there, and our lads had gone up and were able to capture it. But there were many casualties. And so I had my jeep, and my backman driver, he took the CO's jeep, and of course he shouldn't have, but I told him to. And then Frank Lott, that young lad was the driver for the signals jeep. And he volunteered. So the three of us went past a burnt-out tank and a carrier. The road was under observation, and we got through to a sunken road. And there we would grab a stretcher, run out and grab a lad and bring him back to the so-called safety of the sunken road. But I'll never forget one young lad, when we ran up to him with the stretcher, he was lying there, both legs hit, unable to move, and as soon as I ran up to him, he looked up to me and said, "Padre, I'm the answers to a stretcher bearer's prayers, only weigh 120 pounds. Now, think of that, lying there in pain, unable to move. At any moment, a mortar might come over and kill him. And yet, he was thinking, how can I cheer them up? Padre, I'm only 120 pounds. So those are the sort of things I remember. But after we loaded our 3 jeeps, I said to Bill, you follow me, stagger it a bit. And so I drove and got my wounded out. Bill, he got his out, but they made a direct hit on the 3rd jeep, and Frank Lott and all his wounded were killed. Now those are the sort of things I remember. And I remember I used to have many bad feelings about that. And then I thought, I don't know. Frank was willing to give his life for others. He didn't think of the cost. He just thought, how can I help? Yes, it was stirring days. The thing that I'll never forget, I always will remember, is the spirit of the men. And from the highest to the lowest. It was wonderful. Oh, for the first few weeks ashore, we were simply dug in, moving from one position to another to throw up dust so the enemy would think we were going to attack and hold their armor there at Caen. But finally, on the 8th of July, we had to break out of the bridgehead. And my unit had a very, very, very fierce battle. More than half the unit were either killed or wounded. And that day I shall always remember, the 8th of July. And I took my jeep and would drive up into the field where they were lying, grab them, and then come back out with them. And on one of my trips, I remember seeing a major from the North Nova Scotia Highlanders. They were in our brigade, and so were the Glengarrians. By the way, Nellie's husband was the Glengarrians. We were the so-called Highland Brigade. And anyway, this North Nova Scotia Highlander was sitting there outside of the aid post. And I told him to get in. He says, no, there's many more worse off than I am, even though he had lost his right arm. But the next time I came down with a load, he was still there and he looked awful. So I helped him in. And I discovered later his name was Kennedy. He was a Bisley shot, and he had lost his right arm. And I read in the paper many years afterwards how he was the adjutant of the Bisley team and used to take them over to England. He became a member of Parliament, by the way, so you see that he lived a very fruitful life even after his wounds. But after the Battle of Huron on the 8th of July, when we finally came out for a few days' rest, I remember holding you can't call it a church parade. I remember my first leave. I went up to visit my father's people in Aberdeenshire. And this old fellow said to me, oh, you're a chaplain, are you? Oh, you'll have a nice, safe touch. All you'll do is call them back for a church parade. Oh, what a hope. No, church parade was a formal thing. But usually a Padre, I remember at our course in Aldershot, one of the Padres said to us, senior Padre who had come down from CMHQ, Canadian Military Headquarters in London, to give us a talk on what was expected of us. And one of them said, sir, what are the Padre's duties? And he said, duties? He doesn't have duties. He goes with his men, and whatever he can do to help them, he does it. But remember, you represent the church. And I think that was one of the finest answers I've ever had. We had no given duties. And as for church parades, we had some very fine ones in England and some of those lovely churches before we left to go to the continent. But when we were in action, I can count on my one hand the number of church parades we had. And so I'll very briefly go over some of them. If you get too tired, just raise your hand, and I'll know where to start. I knew it. Don Ross held up his hand. Oh, well. Don't worry, I'll get even with him. But anyway, that church service that we had after we came out from Caen, it was sad. Some of these lads had lost their best friends. And there they were, sitting in a corner of a field, and I held the service with them. Many of them cried. Yes, we cried on many occasions. It was very, very sad. And I was going to say, too, on this plaque in Gaul, in the armories there, I noticed the two MacDonald boys. Now, whenever I hear the word Crieff, you know, Crieff Hills or something as you call it, well, there were 4 lads from Crieff, which is a little farming community just outside Galt. And they got in their car one night and one day and drove over to Galt and all joined up. The 2 MacDonald boys became company sergeant majors. They were both killed with us, and when you look at their names and you think of them, what wonderful chaps they were. And there were so many on there that I could go on for a long time telling you about them and what happened to them. Then, of course, we broke through in the Valley Gap and we went towards Boulogne, where to take out the Channel Port. I saw one of the saddest sights at Boulogne. We had a truce to enable the civilians to come out. And they were streaming out, you know, men, women, and children. Some of them were quite old. Some of them were pushing baby buggies. And they had a long way to go to an assembly area where they were to get on transport and be taken further back. And there was an order that we weren't allowed to have civilians on our Jeep. But I couldn't care about that. I took my Jeep and I would ferry some of them, especially the much older people, up this hill towards the assembly area. But I often think of what the civilians must have suffered. We forget them so often. Now, the next church parade I'll tell you about is one in the Breskin pocket. Now, I have to watch myself. You know, we say Holland when we don't mean Holland at all. We mean some other part. And this was in the Breskin's pocket, which is not Holland. It was in the Netherlands. And we landed from the water at night in order to make the enemy fight on 2 fronts. I can honestly say I was awfully scared that night. There I was in my Jeep on board a buffalo. Now, a buffalo has nothing to do with our West, you know. It's almost like a tank. It's got, it goes on land and on water. And we were to make, an assault landing at night. It was a Saturday we started off. We had to go up the Ghent Canal to a place called Ternausen. And from there we were to go on a ramp over to the water, open water, and then go from there. However, the ramp had broken down. But on the way up the canal, it was a Saturday, and all the people were out shopping. And some of them on their bicycles would drive along the side of us and wish us well and so on. Oh, a surprise attack. How could it be? But anyway, we finally got going and that next night, and 2 lights went up, and we all made for the shore. How we got ashore, I'll never know. However, I do know now. I came back, I was at Camp Niagara, and there was a lecture in Niagara Falls by Brigadier Churchill Mann on the Second World War. So naturally, I wanted to hear what he was going to say. And one of the things he said was, one of the biggest flukes of the war was a landing in the Scheldt. You see, the Air Force had gone over 2 nights ahead and bombed them. And when they heard these buffaloes, which used to make a tremendous noise, they thought it was the bombers, and they all kept down in their pillboxes until we got ashore. Now, on that dike, the first dike, I buried about 35 of my men. And I remember being at the picnic in the park quite a few years ago. And I remember that time was Dr. Philbrook. And he was telling me how busy he was. And of course, I always have to do one-upmanship, you know. I said, oh, yes, I'm very busy too. Yesterday I was at my old unit's reunion and so on, you know. And he says, who were you with? I said, oh, I was with the Highland Light Infantry. Oh, he said, my brother was killed with the Highland Light Infantry. Philbrook. I said, yes, I buried him on the first dike where we landed. Oh, it can't be my brother, because he wasn't buried there. He was buried in a cemetery in Belgium. Now, most of you have the mistaken notion when you see one of our military cemeteries, so very well kept. They're really wonderful. But the lads, most of them weren't buried there. They were buried wherever they were hit. Sometimes in the Scheldt like that, or sometimes on the other side of the Rhine. But anyway, there you go. You see, I'm remembering too much. I better keep it down. Anyway, I was telling you about church parades. We did have a church parade in Breskin's Pocket, in a place called Beerby. The brigadier called me down and said, Padre, I think we'll have a formal parade, and we'll parade into the center of Beerby, and there's a bandstand there, and you can use that for your pulpit and so on, and conduct it from there. So fine. And then he said, we'll have the pipe band up, and we'll really do it proud. And he said, by the way, Jock, you preach. And of course, in my own humble way, I said, you must know a good preacher when you hear one. He said, oh no, you're the only one we can ever hear. So that sort of put me in my place. But you might be wondering, what do we preach at a time like that? Well, I'll give you an example. There was a great number of what you call battle exhaustion cases. That is, men who come to the end of their tether. They couldn't continue. Their nerves are gone. I've seen men that couldn't move a muscle who were battle exhaustion. And so I thought, well, you didn't have to give a subject because it wasn't printed. I spoke on thinking in a slit trench. Now, you know what a slit trench is. It's a hole that a soldier can dig even with his elbows if he's under fire. But it's a hole he digs and gets down into. And so I was talking about thinking in a slit trench, how you can look in different ways. You can look in, and what do you see? You only see a very, very scared soldier. Yes, you're very much afraid. But then you can look out, and you look out, and you see another head bobbing up, and you yell over to him, and you always have to think of something that might cheer him up, and he cheers you up. And so by looking out, you can be cheered up. But then there's another way. You can look up. And you can look up and you realize that God has looked down on this world from the beginning of time. And so he will continue to look down on us. And we have to trust him. And, it's a tremendous feeling when you're so far down that you can look up. And so they were very simple sermons or addresses, whatever you might call them. And then we continued on, and we got up into, we were the first Canadian unit to cross the Rhine. You never see it much in any of the books, and for a very simple reason, that the Highland Brigade was taken from the Canadians and placed with the 51st Highland Division. And my unit, the HLI, were attached to the 157th Brigade with the Argyll and Sutherlands and the 1st Black Watch. And we went over with them on the 23rd and 24th of March. And we were over there and dug in when the paratroopers landed. And then from there, of course, we moved back into Friesland, and then from there across into Germany again. And we were pursuing the enemy when, on the last night of the war, I'm always amused when I see all the great hooplas about when it was declared it was over, everybody standing up and cheering and so on. We didn't do that at all. The last night of the fighting, we were making an attack. And we attached ourselves to one of the companies, and lugging a stretcher, It was going so far and then you would stop, going so far and then stop. Started to rain, it was miserable. And in the morning the word came through. All the officers were to assemble as the brigadier had a message for us. And so we did, and he came up and told us, well, it's over in this particular part. He didn't say the war was over. The war was over, the fighting in this particular part. And nobody said 3 cheers or hip hip hooray. We all said, that's fine, and found a dry place and lay down for a rest. But we did have a church parade, and this is the last one, so it's all right. I'm getting nearly finished. This was our last church parade that I had with the boys. It was in a place called Aurich in Germany. And the brigadier said, we'll have this church parade, we'll have the pipe bands, and we'll put parade into town, and we'll have it in the great big church that was in Aurich. So I went in to make arrangements, and there was non-fraternization, so I had to invite the organist out onto the sidewalk, and I told her we were going to have it at 1100 hours on Sunday, not by your permission, but we were going to have it. And so on the Sunday, with a pipe band in the lead, they marched into town. And in the meantime, I was up in a high pulpit with the doors open, looking out into the courtyard. And the civilians followed the pipe band, and they were all assembled out there. Now, you'll see me sometimes when this particular tune is played for a hymn, have a sort of a grin on my face. I can't help it. But anyway, I thought now, for the first hymn, I'll have Zion's King shall reign victorious, all the earth shall own his sway. I thought that's most in keeping. Now, I didn't know what the tune was. In fact, as you know, I'm not very musical. I only play the bagpipes. But anyway, I chose that hymn because of its words. But I didn't realize the tune. So when the organist played it, I looked out into the courtyard, and all the civilians came rigidly to attention. As you know, it's Austria, Deutschland, über alles in der Welt. And so they likely thought, those Canadians, they're a little bit queer, aren't they? Imagine playing that for their church service. But that was it. But I'll never forget that church parade, because it was one of the saddest. You would have thought it would be one of the happiest. The fighting was over. But it's a strange thing, and many of the veterans will tell you, that somehow when we were in battle, when we were in action, we were so close to those who had been killed, and we could have been killed in the next battle with them, that we still felt one with them. We used to be standing around talking sometime, and we talk about one of the chaps who had been killed in the last battle as if he was still with us. It was just like that. Yes, it was and here we were. The fighting was over. We will be returning to Canada. And all those chaps whom we loved won't be returning with us. It was a very sad time to think that we had made it and they hadn't. And so when we have a remembrance service, or the act of remembrance, I have no trouble remembering. And I know many of you do not either. Many of you lost, say, a brother, or the First World War is a bit of history now to us. The Second World War is fading into history too. And so that means that we have to be very, very careful and remember that war is only a quarrel between individuals multiplied millions of times. And so we have to learn to live at peace one with the other. And by doing that, we'll be bringing peace in our time.